From Redox and Healthcare Strategy Bullpen, welcome to Diagnosing Health Tech, the show where we talk about healthcare and the technology driving it with the most interesting leaders in the industry.
Good morning, Health Tech. I'm Jeff Englander. I'm the founder and principal of Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. I am joined by Carolyn Brinkerhoff, who's the director of cloud enablement at Redox. I know you were all expecting Marty Wimbihan. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And unfortunately, Marty had a work emergency today, so got pulled away. So what we're going to do is we're going to cover some of the material in terms of cybersecurity, cover some of the recent articles, try to talk about that, put it in context a little bit, and then Marty will be joining us at a later date. Then we're going to dig into some deeper articles in the industry from a broad cross-sector of the industry, including Cigna putting its Medicare Advantage business potentially up for sale, the fall of Olive, and a couple of other interesting articles. So, please do join in. This is where we really could, think a lot of participation from the audience will be super interesting and super insightful. So, Carolyn, I just wanted to go over, what you're kind of hearing in the industry right now, what I'm hearing. One interesting thing is I had the pleasure of being invited to the Harvard Business School Healthcare Alumni Association event last week. Super, super interesting, and a lot of talk about difficult fundraising environment, people really buckling down, focusing more on the fundamentals of running the business, less about creating revenue and really creating long-term sustainable business models. And I'm just wondering what you're hearing out there.
I'm hearing the same thing, that there's a major shift towards profitability overall. I think you can see a lot of that in the way the industry is changing right now for health tech startups, where in one of our first articles, we say health tech startups are ripe for merger and acquisition activity. And that's because there's limited funding out there now. People are more hesitant to buy. So creating a profitable, sustainable business model is key to getting these businesses to thrive.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that the fundraising environment's changed. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about Olive. We're going to talk about, creating customer-centric organizations, and we're going to talk about a different vision of measuring health equity. So I think there's a lot of things going on, but I think really the biggest fundamental difference is you've moved away from a very frothy fundraising environment really to a very blocking and tackling environment. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And that's even extending, at the conference I was at, extending to, biotech and some other areas as well.
Oh, yeah. So, and question for you on that, Jeff. With this new shift in how in fundraising and what we see in the healthcare startup industry, what's your thought about the increase in inside rounds for startups, where investors are just helping accelerate the portfolio they're already working with today?
Oh, I think that's really interesting. I think you're going to see more of that. I think you're starting to see more, venture debt, because people have events they're trying to get to. They have milestones, they have contracts they believe they can fulfill, but they need that bridge. And I also do think you're going to see a lot of consolidation. We're hoping to arrange a show towards the end of the year with a couple of Wall Street analysts for the outlook for the year. And I think you're going to see a lot more consolidation, or frankly, just players closing up the doors and the party's over. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what this looks like in 2024.
Do you think that there's any correlation between how over the last few years we've seen an increase in health systems consolidating, creating these massive integrated delivery networks, and a lot of these health startups are selling to those groups? Do you think that this path of mergers and acquisitions also corresponds to the fact that that is happening to their main customer base?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think logically it's got to. The other thing I would say is a couple things going on in addition to that. One of which is a lot of these startups came out of the chutes very quickly in a very, very frothy environment, but selling point solutions. And a lot of the hospitals themselves are just overwhelmed with point solutions. We had John Halamka on earlier in November. I'm losing track of time already. And John was talking about, I'm sorry, earlier in October. And John was talking about, I think they have 2,200 separate apps at Mayo. And the hospitals can't put up with that or can't really deal with that, put up as a bad term. The other thing I would say is you have incredible pressure on the hospitals themselves. Their model is changing. They're having to deal with much more outpatient care, some of which is less revenue generating. We have talked about the impact that can have on margins, or where they're going to have to focus less on top line, more on margins. And so I do think that's an issue. And I think that'll continue. As I said, 2024 is, I think, going to be a bit of a harder year for companies as they seek to get into the markets. Now, on the hospital end, I think you're going to see more of them putting together more complete data strategies and working with the pieces they have to get them to work better together and to get a better finished product out the door for customers.
Absolutely. I work with folks every day, every week, working to take their disparate data sources and get them funneled into a single place where they can, fully understand their patient longitudinal record and find the best way to close gaps in care for them. And because there is so much more than one source of data, as you mentioned earlier, there are so many disparate apps that are collecting these things and treating your patient in some way. We talk about digital therapeutics a little bit later, like things like that. All of that, it encompasses a patient's story. And so getting all of that into one place is going to be key in 2024.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me, as we talk about that, Marty was going to come on and talk about cybersecurity, planning, disaster recovery. So let's address a couple articles there, and then we'll move on to, some broader picture articles, as it talked about in terms of Olive and Cigna. But so first article up today is Cook County warns of a data breach for 1.2 million medical records at a medical transportation firm. Very interesting. Cook County in Chicago, a medical transportation firm that they use for hospitals and clinics, released the personal records of 1.2 million patients. It was due to an unauthorized individual accessing systems, so some of the data stored. And I think this is really interesting. Now, in this particular case, it wasn't, but I think in general, the hacks and the breaches have gotten more sophisticated. They've gone from one-off incidents with unsophisticated actors. You see more and more state-sponsored terrorism, more criminal conspiracies. Per HHS, 88 million people have been affected by large data breaches. And, the people affected by data breaches has risen by 60% in 2023 in terms of major cyber attacks. And I think that's, really going to be something that we're going to have to deal with. And at the end here, I've got a couple of suggestions from the Joint Commission on things to be prepared for. But I wonder what your thoughts are, Carolyn.
I think that cyber attacks are everywhere. It's not just this industry that has those experiences, but this industry hurts so deeply when these cyber attacks happen because the patient data that's being stored and collected in these systems is so private, so personal, and that kind of information being leaked or taken out, if you're able to access that stuff, is really impactful to a patient's experience, to a person's life. So I think that there should be, and there is a true emphasis on data security and cybersecurity in this industry for a reason. My other thought is this is just an example of what I mentioned earlier with that there are so many various downstream systems and integrated systems that touch patient data. It's not just one place where your data could be impacted. So it's very important that anybody who is exchanging personal health information follows the appropriate rules and regulations and stays up to date on their cybersecurity to minimize these kinds of data breaches.
Yeah, and I think that to me the paradigm has shifted quite a bit. Is there's tremendous focus on what you can do to prevent these, but more and more the thought process has to be is what do we do once this happens? How are we prepared? Have we tested our policies and procedures? Have we trained? And are we ready? And I think that touches a little bit on the second article as well.
Yeah, I'll hop into it. I'll hop into the next one. So next we have HHS settles $100,000 ransomware investigation. Jeff, want to tell me a little bit about it?
So HHS settled. This is the first case where they have, imposed a penalty, $100,000. A company called Doctors Management Systems. The company released the records of over 200,000 individuals. As I said, this is the first ransomware settlement. And as we said last week, we did an article on ransomware, and the ransomware attacks have cost almost $80 billion in downtime. On average, it's lost about 14 business days, 539 ransomware attacks on 10,000 hospitals between 2016 and mid-October of 2023. And the numbers are really interesting because the cost, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, ransomware went from anywhere from $1,600 to $10 million. And more interestingly and more concerning for the hospitals themselves is about 25% of providers have saw a rise in mortality due to ransomware attacks. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, Carolyn.
Oh, I have a lot. Back in the day in some previous roles, I helped with business continuity planning and helped with that plan for what happens in some kind of event where where one of your systems goes down. The process for that is super intensive. It takes many months to prepare yourself to be ready for an attack like this because when there is a ransomware investigation, typically a system could go down, or when there is a cyber attack, a system could go down. And like, how does that impact patient care? It means that the record access that providers have is limited on their patients. They're not able to do the same documentation. They don't have the same access to BPAs and alerting to make sure that they're ordering the right things for their patients. There's a lot of things that we rely on in our software and tooling to provide great patient care. In a downtime, there are offline systems like backup systems that come up where you can be working in the most recent copy of your system. There are failover strategies that allow you to go to the disaster recovery environment and bring up another version of your systems for you to be able to get everybody online and load all of the data back into the system. All of these things get practiced regularly to make sure that all of the systems are up to date and work in events like this. But I can see how that has an impact on mortality rates because without the tools that you rely on every day, whether it's a few minutes or a few hours in experiences like this, that could have a major impact to patient care. So this is something I definitely want to ask Marty about, proactive evaluation when we finally get him on the line, because in this article, it calls out that doctors management services wasn't meeting certain criteria for preparing. And I just love hearing more about the best practices. I've been exposed to it before.
I think this is interesting because I think this is starting to put some teeth into the legislation. And, as we've talked about before, what seems to be happening is there was really kind of soft enforcement, and then you're getting more and more into, starting to see some teeth. And I think you'll see some, bigger cases, where people will just try to make examples of, or the regulators will try to make examples of what's going on. And, along those lines, in the third article, we're talking about a new bipartisan Senate group, including Senator Cassidy, is proposed a group to tackle cybersecurity, and they want to improve cybersecurity in the healthcare sector. Also includes Senator Warner. And Senator Warner has solicited a white paper talking about applying mandates to better cybersecurity practices for companies that are in Medicare. Now, there's a decent amount of uncertainty as whether you'd get widespread support for this, in part, not so much because of the bipartisan rancor that's going on the Hill right now, because most people can agree that healthcare is always a healthy target, particularly hospitals, drug companies, insurance companies. But there is no question that something needs to be done. The question is what's the best way to do that? Any thoughts on what you see coming out of this, Carolyn?
I hope that we see improvement and process in the industry. One of the quotes that I pulled out from this article that I really appreciated was where one of the physicians in the task group said, just like a strong military and police force defends us against physical attacks, we must ensure health institutions can safeguard against increasing cyber threats and protect Americans' crucial health data. That statement felt impactful to us, or to me as I was reading it, where there should be some sort of protection for this kind of very personal information. And I'm happy to see folks coming together and working on it for the better of the patient.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I did want to go through, there was an article that the Joint Commission put out in August, which I thought was really helpful. And then did want to, make one statement. I think, the Joint Commission talked about, I think, some of the preparation, as you alluded to. One was be ready to be down. The other was to form a planning committee that has created policies and procedures for not only if, but when you go down. Talked about developing the procedures that we just mentioned, establishing response time. And I think really important is training for downtime and having people, as you and I were preparing for this, we're talking about, using paper records in backup. And this is one of the things we'll talk about with Marty, using paper records for backup, making sure you then take what you do in paper records and make sure that goes into the EMR and all of those other important things. And then one other important point that I thought the Joint Commission made, which was really interesting, was communicate about what systems are affected, but don't use your website to communicate any of this, because your website might be one of the sites that has been hacked and could further proliferate the problem. One thing I will say, and I'm probably not as staunch in this on a lot of issues, but I do think there's a decided risk of overregulation here. I think one of the problems we have with EMRs is that they were created to check a box. They were created to do certain things on a regulatory front, but they really weren't created to improve the longitudinal health record that you mentioned and to improve care for patients. And we're spending all this time and all this money right now, kind of trying to fix that with health tech. And I think there's a risk that if we go too far, even on cybersecurity, that this is going to create an even bigger problem. So I think we have to be very balanced when we do that.
Yes. And these kinds of rulings and bills should apply to anywhere patient information is stored and not just one place. Because if you have the data, you're taking on that kind of responsibility.
Yeah. So super interesting next article. And I hope there are people out there who could, comment or want to lob in a question on this. So once high-flying AI healthcare startup Olive is shut down, they're selling off their assets. If people recall, as far as late 2021, Olive had raised $400 million at a $4 billion valuation. I think they raised $925 million in total. In its current form, Olive was launched in 2017 with the idea of tackling high volume, repetitive, and manual tasks like prior authorization. They acquired a company called Verata. And then they decided to move to building enterprise AI for hospitals. In 2022, Olive bought Empiric Health, which is an AI empowered analytics and service company to focus on identifying unwanted variations in clinical procedures, starting with surgery. So curious as to, where you fall out on this. This is your marketplace, Carolyn. Tons of healthcare startups. What do you think of all of going under?
I think any company going under is sad for many reasons. I think for this one specifically, I feel like the space that they were playing in was ripe and ready for innovation. So it's sad to also just see like the loss of um, a company working to solve this space. Like automated prior authorizations are so important. Automated RCM workflows are so key to creating a better patient experience, or else like the experience of billing or trying to figure out your claim or being able to get the procedure or care you need can be very painful. And when we're trying to apply AI to speed it up, make it better, make it more complete, um, I think that can change a lot. Um, but at the same time, I understand that like the the space that they are in also it has tons of process, has tons of regulation. There's a lot to take on there that may have been really, really challenging for a startup to manage and deal with. So I think from a tooling perspective and from a product perspective, like this space they played in was ready for innovation, and the market just couldn't respond in the same way at that time. What are your thoughts, Jeff?
I think it's interesting. I have a little bit of a different take. I think they just got too far afield from what they really should have been doing and should have been focusing on. At one time they had 38 different businesses. They started a venture studio. They were hemorrhaging money. To me, there's absolutely no reason, for a startup to be starting a venture studio. They had a little bit of success. As I ran the London Marathon in April. I finished it. That would be like me, starting a training facility or training studio for people who've run the London Marathon. I had a little bit of success, but I nowhere near the amount I needed to establish a business to teach other businesses. So I just thought that was absolutely ridiculous. I think they lost their focus. The purpose of a business is about meeting customers' needs, creating a profitable, sustainable business model that's going to make money. And I just don't think they ever really had a path to that.
Awesome. We do have a guess in the chat, Jeff. Vinu said, my guess, it was a data problem. In order for AI to happen in healthcare, the data sources need to be better than they are today. And that definitely makes sense to me. Like a lot of the data sources that you'll find like are not. You'd be surprised where you expect there to be structured data. It's not. It's all unstructured. You'd be surprised to see the how the word I'm thinking of is how unnormalized, but that's not a right word. You'd be surprised to see how
variable and how.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think you said Vinu was the gentleman's name, and I hope I've got that correct. I totally agree that I think doing AI is also a data problem, but I also think there were issues with all of itself in the sense that they went into a number of their prospects, is my understanding, and said, hey, we can get this ready for AI in a certain number of weeks, but totally unrealistic sales expectations, totally unrealistic in terms of what they were trying to do that quickly. I think some of the things, I've heard estimates they went into one as quickly as I think 8 weeks. I think they could have done something like that, but it certainly would have taken longer than 8 weeks, even data with problem notwithstanding. So I do think there are a bunch of issues, but I do think there was a number of company specific issues as well. Did you want to go on to the next article, Carolyn?
Yeah, sure. We'll hop into the next one. Next, we've got Cigna explores selling Medicare Advantage, their Medicare Advantage business. Jeff, tell me about a little bit about this one.
And also just apologize. Let me step back. People in the audience, please do feel free to, send in questions. It's a bit of an open mic day without Marty here, so we'd love to have more of your questions. Just to recap, I'm Jeff Englander. I am the founder and principal of Healthcare Strategy Bullpen. I'm here with Carolyn Brinkerhoff from Redox. We are talking today about some of the interesting and exciting articles out in health tech about what's going on in the industry. Love your thoughts. And as Carolyn mentioned, Cigna is exploring the sale of its Medicare Advantage business, and really interesting in that Medicare Advantage has been in the news a lot. We have another article as well, but Reuters has reported that Cigna has hired an investment bank to explore the sale of its Medicare Advantage business. A little bit of a surprise because Medicare Advantage has been a relatively profitable area for a number of people. There's expectations that this could fetch as much as $5 to $7 billion. Reasoning behind this, my understanding is that the growth in their Medicare Advantage business is falling short of targets. They have been targeting double-digit growth, and they have really not been seeing that in their particular Medicare Advantage business. The other thing I'll add is Cigna covers only about 600,000 lives, which is less than 2% share nationwide. And to give you some sense, the top five top five companies in Medicare Advantage have about 75% of share in that market, and that's been consolidating. Particularly companies like Cigna lost some share last year. The Blues have been losing share. And I think that will further consolidate. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I might throw that back to you and see what you think, Carolyn.
I think when I was reading through this, I thought like invest or divest in Medicare Advantage business. Like what would be the pros and cons here? What are you looking at? Like you would invest where you see growth potential, revenue opportunities, or if you're trying to diversify. Divest if you're facing regulatory issues, market saturation, operational challenge, unfavorable reimbursement changes, right? Like, or if you're trying to refocus. So like with this specific news article, like when you look at what's happening to them, when you talk about their own market share, when you look at the settlement they had around false and inaccurate MA diagnostic codes too, they're having reimbursement challenges. They're seeing market saturation. Like signs could point towards that they're making the choice to divest. When you look at what's going on around them, but I am just curious to see if this is rumored or if it is just if it's untrue and they're going to continue with it.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I will say is I think they they are really trying to focus their businesses. They've got Evernorth. They were able to sell, I believe, their life business and redeploy the proceeds. I think it's a good time to sell in that some of the stars rating methodology has changed, and they have fairly highly rated plans, and so they'll probably get top dollar for it. And so I don't think if you don't have the bulk, it's going to be an even tougher business to compete in. But with that, let me talk, and we'll keep on Medicare Advantage here. But the next article was a Harvard study found that Medicare Advantage enrollees have fewer hospitalizations. The Harvard study, which I should note was funded in part by Inovalon, found that MA enrollees had 70% fewer readmissions, 24% fewer hospitalizations, and about 60% fewer acute hospitalizations. And the authors believe that this could be useful, particularly for underserved communities in identifying areas where MA could help improve care. And curious about your thoughts, Carolyn.
I think that, well, one, the stats are very interesting when you look at just like the amount of fewer readmissions than fee-for-service beneficiaries, when you look at the lower rates of high-risk medication use too. Like the stats are very compelling. I encourage everyone to go check this article out. But what makes me most excited about this is that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services are reviewing and updating the framework to require health plans to have more equitable care, or they could risk receiving that downgraded star rating. Excuse my cat. She likes to make little cameos whenever I'm on a webcam. But yeah, I think that any kind of shift towards equitable care, I am always in favor of, because the folks out there who need it can't always get the care they want, they require. So anything that we can do, Medicare and Medicaid services could do to help with that, I'm all here for.
That well, you have to excuse me. I love the cat. Had I known, I would have brought my pups up here, although one would have been made it virtually impossible to talk about. I do think, and I'm surprised that, I mean, there's got to be somebody out in the audience, the skeptic out there is saying the reason that MA has fewer hospitalizations and fewer readmits is that the MA plans have been denying care. There's a bunch of research out there that MA plans have been using prior auth to help withhold care. There's also some research from people in the industry and other academics citing that MA plans are overpaid and that they have used a lot of upcoding in terms of HCC codes to get more money. So I think this is an interesting study. I'm a little bit skeptical just because, it is funded by Inovalon in part. And I do think this is going to be MA, PBMs. We talked about the focus on cybersecurity earlier. That the Hill needs somebody to focus on to get something done and be able to do it where you have a enemy that both parties can agree on. And I think it's going to be healthcare between now and the election. And so I do expect to see, more on the PBMs. I do expect to see more on MA as well.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move on to the next article?
Yeah, let's do it. Next, we have a paradigm shift towards reimbursing the root causes of diseases.
So this article is talking about, codes are only capturing about 2% of claims. Many systems are, and when we say this, let me back up. The article was talking about social determinants of health and capturing and screening for social determinants of health. And the author is arguing that medical codes, are only captured, for social determinants. So housing insecurity, food insecurity, things of that nature were not being captured. Many systems are not equipped to capture codes. And also, we've done some work on this. We had a blog post on it a while back. 90% of hospitals and systems, reported successfully screening patients for social needs, but only 30% reported having a formal relationship with a community-based provider for their target population. So, Carolyn, what was your takeaway from this article?
I had lots of takeaways from this one. Loved this article. My first thought was this.
How did your cat feel?
She's indifferent about a lot of things, except for birds. Some of the things that came to mind here were that one of the metrics that they presented was 60 to 80% of health are driven by social determinants of health, but we're only capturing this data in less than 2% of claims. So it's very difficult if you're working with claims data, which is oftentimes like the source of what happened and what kind of care was provided, to actually provide any true statistics on social determinants of health, because it's not there. Like what were the differences between, one group over another? But at the same time, if this author is making an argument for we need to be documenting more, that's like the one thing that will set any kind of clinician or provider or like or nurse or anyone who works in a health system who has to do some kind of documentation, just send them off, because HCOs and providers are understaffed. They do what's required. Like they hate the little red exclamation point or stop sign saying you need to enter this. They don't want more clicks. Like, they are already strained and stretched for what they need to document today. And if this argument is we need to document more, I think the answer might be we need to be more creative about how we get that data, how we grab it, how we learn about where this patient is, because saying like you should be writing down more is a trigger word to a lot of people who are trying to provide care. So if we can start collecting this, it has to be in some kind of automated fashion. It's not something that we should be asking HCO staff or health system staff to do, or provider staff to do, because they're already strained by documenting so much. That's my first thought. And Jeff, I want to know if you have any opinions there.
Well, it's interesting because we did not talk about that part of this up front. And so one of the things I went and researched is there was a study that was done, and it showed that, it was talking exactly that about the stress on clinicians. And initially, about a third of staff and over half of clinicians in one study felt that they were just too busy to deal with this. And when they actually had to do it, the response across the board was kind of, oh, it's not that bad. And by the end of the study, those numbers had declined from 33% of staff who felt it was really bad to about 10% having to deal with this, and over 50%, so almost 60% of clinicians down to 20%. And they actually found the data to be really helpful and useful. So I do think that is, one rebuttal to that. And I do think it can be done in certain areas in ways that the problem I do have, and you may talk about this in a sec, is that once you get this data, what do you do with it? Because you're asking people about these problems, and they're very difficult problems for people to address. People don't like to say, they're homeless, or they don't like to say, or unhoused. They don't like to say they don't have a job. They don't like to say, and nor would anyone want to say they can't afford to put food on the table. And then once they admit that vulnerability to a clinician, the clinician really is powerless right now to do anything about it. They can't write a prescription for a home. They can't write a prescription to get someone a job. So I think that's one issue is there's got to be a better connection in with social service agencies and others to do something about that. And I know you said you had other thoughts.
Those are all great points, Jeff. It heartens me to hear that being able to track this doesn't seem as bad for the staff. But it's also really disheartening to just think about what can they do after without, programs that they need for community outreach and partnerships to be able to, address the issues outside of just their single encounter with a patient. My other thoughts on this article were around the second piece where they were saying folks are doing more screenings. But I did also think that section was pretty funny, because they said socioeconomic barriers make doing screenings more difficult and complicated, because if you need to outreach to them asynchronously, it's hard to get a hold of a lot of these groups unless you are in person, which also makes the surveys incomplete. If you can't actually reach the people you're trying to get to, and getting the right responses, the data itself is still incomplete, and you're still hindered from doing the research you're looking for or providing the care you're looking to give.
Yeah, and we'll touch on this in a little bit in the next article. One thing I think that providers and payers, have to get away from is trying to reach people through maybe conventional methods, I guess would be one way of thinking about it. I don't think surveying some people for social determinants of health, doing this, you have to go out into the community to do these things. You have to use boots on the ground. You have to go out. And I think, the next article talks about hospitals struggle to embrace consumer-centric care. And, it was talking about the Kaufman Hall 2023 State of Healthcare Consumer Report. And I think the Kaufman report did a good job in itself, but I disagree with the approach that the providers are taking. So the report itself was talking about that the progress towards consumer-centric care was slow, and it was talking about how hospitals have struggled to measure that, and they have continued to measure traditional metrics. And one of the things that bothers me, and I find particularly gnawing, is trying to do this through surveys, trying to do this through questionnaires or one or two question text messages or a robo call. You have to get out into the community, and we're going to have hopefully someone on, hopefully Lisa Fitzpatrick, who I was on the HEAL committee from the Connected Health Initiative and Consumer Technology Association, and the HEAL committee was looking at healthcare equity, and what you need to do is you need to go out and walk around the community, walk into the stores, walk into the places of worship, walk into literally the barbershops. There's a guy out in, it's not Louisiana, I forget where he's doing it, but he's providing mental health care in barbershops. So you have to get out into the community, and the leaders have to get out into the community. So instead of spending 3 or 4 hours in a meeting about how do we address the community needs, those 3 or 4 hours would be much better spent, half an hour in a car, even an hour in the community and an hour back would be much better than 4 hours in a meeting about how do we address these needs. What's your opinion, Carolyn?
Well, what you're mentioning just reminds me so much of our conversation with Dr. David Shulkin, of how when he first took his role as the secretary for the VA, I think one of the first things he said was he went out and spent time with veterans and got into the community. So it just reminds me a lot about the experience that he was preaching and encouraging other providers to lean into. What I took away from this article was so much about provider-centric versus patient-centric models. I love math. I'm a little nerdy, so I was thinking about, what are these metrics? What's actually being tracked? Like when you think about a provider-centric model, it's like patient volumes, admissions, give me the numbers of the throughput of my hospital, right? A patient-centric metrics are a little bit more difficult. Oftentimes we think of that as CSAT, how was the experience, stuff like you were talking about, Jeff. Other things could be total cost of care, which can be difficult to do without your payer or without the insurance plans you're working with to understand how much a patient actually paid. And then I'd be curious, Jeff, if you had any recommendations on what other metrics are valuable to track in a patient-centric model. And they note a lack of consumer-centric metrics. And I want to know, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's hard to get if you have recommendations for what the patient-centric metrics are, and why is it so hard for people to get them now?
I do. Well, I don't have recommendations for specific metrics, but I do have recommendations what you need to do. And we work with this with a couple folks. I think one is looking at, and we're going to have Kenny Cole from Ochsner next week, looking at and what do you need to do up front to earn the trust of that community before you can really think about those patient-centric metrics. Because particularly in underserved communities, there's a huge trust gap, and you've got to earn that trust first. And before you start asking people questions that they're probably not going to answer that honestly, or even not going to bother to answer, you have to figure out, why does that exist? The other thing you need to look at is what are the physical, logistical, mechanical barriers to care that people are facing. And then I think the other thing is, what is it that you can do as an organization within the community to help alleviate these. There was talk in an article last week about who's responsible for what in terms of the social determinants of health. And I think you can't put it all on the hospital or the payers, but you have to figure out what other community organizations can you partner with. And we talked last week about in Houston, it was a partnership between the healthcare organizations, the communications companies, in this case, AT&T Wireless providing phones to be able to track people, a housing provider to give people housing, and what role can you play in that whole ecosystem? So those are some of the things I think would be helpful. Oh, one other thing that I would really think is there's not enough done with customer journey mapping from the point of view of the customer. We're hoping to have another person who did some work with the NHS on, and one of the things that she said is they actually interviewed the receptionists to get the point of view of what are the patients saying right as they walk in the door. And those are a couple things I think people should focus on.
Very interesting. Thanks, Jeff.
So let's talk about the next article, which is a formal framework for incorporating equity into healthcare quality and measurement. And this was an interesting one. It gets a little dense. So Carolyn, what I'm going to do is, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit from the article to get everybody versed and then make some comments. And so bear with me, folks. You can see I'm looking up at my notes. Most quality measurement efforts do not explicitly target health equity. According to the article, this was in Health Affairs. And they said addressing one aspect of equity may be in competition with addressing others. So, for example, if you're rewarding performance for rural patients, an unintended consequence on racial ethnic disparities, rural patients tend to be overwhelmingly white. So this may impact, other minorities and other people. Conversely, if you're rewarding performance among Black patients, it may have negative consequences on, rural patients because Black patients are overwhelmingly in metropolitan areas. What the authors state is we argue that any equity-focused measurement strategy should follow from the desired incentive structure and equity goals. And for me, what that means is they're trying to say that any equity strategy should try to focus, on where you want to distribute those goals instead of having an incentive structure determined to be ad hoc by the measurement approach. And what they're saying is one possible weighting scheme would specify that all racial or ethnic, rural and metropolitan, disabled and non-disabled groups receive equal weights. So this would unweight the smaller groups to make the total weight more equal. There was a lot there, and hopefully I didn't put you to sleep, Carolyn. I think this is a very interesting idea. I think it makes a really good point about being cognizant when you're measuring equity goals and quality goals of what impact it may have on other groups. The problem I have is if you're trying to figure out, what groups to not favor, but what groups you're trying to impact, it becomes a tough slope at sometimes. So you have to be very careful with your weighting measurements. So I think I like the first half of the article. I'm not quite as crazy about the second half and its suggestion. Carolyn, any ideas on where you'd come out on this?
I think that quality measurement and metrics are so hard to start. When you think about, how to weight equity into it adds a whole other level of complexity. And when you think about what are the things to weight and what are the zones to weight, this feels like it will need to be region specific potentially. Like I think health equity should be taken into account, but how that actually reflects in metrics tracking and what are the red, yellow, green rules for it. I think a more educated workforce than myself when it comes to this kind of care needs to be tasked to work on it and get into an agreement on it, because there are just so many variables. And these kinds of quality metrics have so many variables to start that it will just complicate it. So I think that a team of experts needs to get into the room and define what is most important here, or else I don't think we'll see resolve.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think since we're getting close to the top of the hour, I'm probably going to try to wrap us up. But one other thought I just will leave people with is that outside of the article, I do think that it will fluctuate a little bit with whatever party is in power. But health equity is going to become an increasingly important part of the system, more to measure. And I do think there's a lot of data that supports this, because the numbers, if you can get in and fix some of these things, it's a lot cheaper to fix them up front than it is to fix them on the back end through care through an emergency room, uncompensated care and the like. But I do think that's probably subject for another discussion. So let me go ahead. I want to thank everybody for hanging in there with us since we did lose Marty. But Marty will be back with us on another date. We will go ahead and have at least one more session on cybersecurity. So please do come back and join us. And I do want to thank you for joining us in terms of healthcare strategy bullpen. Please do take a look at this week's blog. The QR code is up there to sign up for the blog. This week's blog was on mHealth. Challenges remain to enable providers to address public health. And so we'd like to invite you to follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn. On Twitter, we're at Healthcare Pen. On LinkedIn, it's Healthcare Bullpen. And we'd like you to think of us as the Rosetta Stone that helps translate the culture and language of health tech and technology into the culture and language of healthcare, which is often not the same, as you try to bring improved health to your patients. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, to Carolyn, to wrap it up.
Thanks again for a great conversation today, Jeff.
Thank you.
Please, for the audience, please subscribe to Diagnosing Health Tech. We've also got a QR code here on the screen. You can get weekly invites to the show. We have great guests on. We talk news. We have a good time, and we hope that you keep coming back. You can also email us, email the show with questions, topic or guest ideas, or anything else. Our show is also sponsored by Redox, my employer. We're the healthcare integration platform that specializes
Important to get that in.
big data and AI, cloud computing. So, we're the Rosetta Stone of translating the disparate healthcare data sources and data out there into a single format that you can make usable and you can make useful. Stealing your line, Jeff.
Okay, well, it's not trademarked yet, so you're welcome to.
From all of us at Diagnosing Health Tech, thank you for watching. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.